The cabin sat like a forgotten gravestone among the towering pines of Montana's wilderness, its weathered boards holding 40 years of secrets. Sarah Martinez clutched her swollen belly as she pushed open the creaking door, her 6-year-old son Tommy close behind, both of them carrying everything they owned in 2 battered suitcases. The hinges protested with a groan that seemed to echo through the forest, as if the cabin itself was reluctant to welcome visitors after decades of solitude. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs as stale air rushed out to greet them, carrying the scent of old wood, dust, and something else, something metallic that made her nose wrinkle. "Mom, it smells weird," Tommy whispered, his small hand finding hers in the dim light filtering through grimy windows. "It just needs some fresh air, baby," Sarah said, forcing optimism into her voice she didn't feel. She flicked the light switch by the door, surprised when a single bare bulb flickered to life overhead. At least the electricity still worked. The interior revealed a sparse but functional living space. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its hearth black with the remnants of countless fires. Mismatched furniture sat beneath white sheets like sleeping ghosts, and cobwebs draped the corners like abandoned party streamers. Sarah set down her suitcase and immediately went to the windows, wrestling with swollen frames to let in some desperately needed fresh air. "Can I explore, Mum?" Tommy asked, already gravitating toward a narrow staircase that led to what she assumed was a loft bedroom. "Stay where I can see you," she called, then caught herself. The cabin was maybe 800 square feet total. Where could he possibly go? Sarah tried to remember her grandfather, but the memories were frustratingly vague. Joseph Martinez had been her father's father, a man who visited sporadically during her childhood and always seemed uncomfortable in their suburban Phoenix home. She remembered calloused hands, the smell of pine needles on his clothes, and eyes that seemed to hold secrets. When he died 3 years ago, she'd been too broke to attend the funeral. The lawyer's call about the inheritance had come as a complete shock. Now, 7 months pregnant, and with $43 to her name, that shock had transformed into desperate gratitude. The eviction notice was dated for last Tuesday. If she hadn't received those keys and the deed to this place, she and Tommy would be sleeping in her car tonight, assuming the repo man hadn't found it yet. "Mom, look at this." Tommy's voice carried an excitement that made her smile despite their circumstances. He'd found an old wooden chest near the fireplace and was lifting out what appeared to be hand-carved animals. "Those are beautiful," Sarah said, kneeling beside him with some difficulty. Her back ached constantly now, and the baby seemed determined to use her ribs as a personal jungle gym. The carvings were exquisite: a bear, an eagle, several horses, all smooth and detailed. "Your great-grandfather must have made these." Tommy lined them up on the dusty floor like a tiny parade. "This one's my favorite," he said, holding up a wolf with amber glass eyes that seemed almost alive in the dim light. Sarah spent the next hour opening windows and removing dust covers, trying to transform the cabin into something resembling a home. The furniture was old but solid: a leather couch that had seen better decades, a small dining table, and a bed upstairs that would do once she found sheets. The kitchen was basic but functional, with a gas stove and a refrigerator that hummed to life when she plugged it in. As afternoon light slanted through the now clean windows, she began to feel cautiously hopeful. The isolation that had seemed oppressive at first now felt protective. No landlords here, no neighbors complaining about Tommy's energy, no bill collectors banging on the door, just silence broken by birdsong and the whisper of wind through pine boughs. "Mom!" Tommy's voice carried a different note now, not excitement, but urgency. "My ball went behind the fireplace." Sarah looked up from the kitchen sink, where she'd been scrubbing years of grime. Tommy's red rubber ball, his most prized possession, was indeed nowhere to be seen. Behind it? She walked over, examining the stone structure. There was indeed a gap between the fireplace and the wall, maybe 8 inches wide. Too narrow for her, especially in her current condition, but just right for a 6-year-old boy. "I can get it," Tommy said, already angling himself toward the opening. "Be careful," Sarah warned, but he was already squeezing through, his small body disappearing into the shadows. For a moment there was only the sound of shuffling and Tommy's muffled voice saying, "Almost got it." Then silence. Then a gasp that made Sarah's blood freeze. "Mom!" Tommy's voice was barely a whisper, trembling with something between fear and wonder. "Mom, you need to see this, right now." The rusted key turned with surprising ease, as if the cabin had been waiting for their arrival. Sarah pushed open the heavy wooden door, wincing as it groaned on ancient hinges. The smell hit her immediately, musty air tinged with pine and something else she couldn't identify. Something metallic and cold. "Mommy, it's dark in there," Tommy whispered, pressing closer to her leg. Sarah fumbled for a light switch, her fingers trailing along the rough-hewn wall just inside the doorway. The electricity had been disconnected years ago, but she'd brought flashlights. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing a surprisingly spacious interior that seemed frozen in time. Grandfather Morris had been gone for 8 years, yet the cabin felt recently abandoned rather than forgotten. A coffee cup sat on the kitchen table, a thin layer of dust coating its rim. Newspapers from 2016 lay folded beside a pair of reading glasses. Sarah's chest tightened as she recognized the familiar wire frames. "Can I explore, Mum?" Tommy had already forgotten his earlier fear, his eyes bright with curiosity as the flashlight beam danced across wooden furniture and stone walls. "Stay where I can see you," she said, one hand instinctively moving to her rounded belly. At 6 months, the pregnancy was becoming increasingly uncomfortable, especially after the long drive on winding mountain roads. Sarah moved deeper into the cabin, her flashlight revealing details that sparked childhood memories. The stone fireplace where Grandfather Morris had told her stories about the old days, the kitchen where he'd taught her to make his famous blueberry pancakes. Everything seemed smaller than she remembered, but then again, she'd been Tommy's age during her last visit. The financial documents clutched in her other hand crinkled as she shifted them. The eviction notice, the medical bills that kept mounting despite David's insurance. The baby would arrive in 3 months, and they'd already maxed out their credit cards trying to keep up with Tommy's therapy sessions. The cabin represented their last hope. If they could sell it quickly, they might be able to start over somewhere cheaper. "Mummy, look!" Tommy's voice echoed from what had been Morris's bedroom. "There's writing on the wall." Sarah hurried toward the sound, her flashlight beam preceding her into the small back room. Tommy stood before the far wall, his small fingers tracing something carved into the wood. "What kind of writing, sweetheart?" "Numbers and letters, like a secret code." Sarah directed her light toward the wall and felt her breath catch. Carved into the wooden planks were indeed numbers and letters, but they weren't random scratches. They formed coordinates. Below them, in her grandfather's distinctive handwriting, were the words, "For Sarah, when you need answers." A chill ran down her spine that had nothing to do with the cabin's dampness. How could he have known she would come here? How could he have known she would need answers? "There's more over here," Tommy called, having moved to examine the adjacent wall. "Mom, this board is loose." Sarah joined him, running her fingers along the edge where he pointed. The wooden plank shifted under pressure, revealing a gap behind it. Her heart began to race as she realized what they'd found, a hidden compartment. "Step back, baby," she whispered, though she wasn't sure why she was whispering. They were alone on the mountain, miles from the nearest neighbor. With trembling fingers, Sarah pried at the loose board. It came away easily, as if designed to be moved. Her flashlight beam penetrated the dark space beyond, illuminating something that made her gasp. Papers, dozens of them, rolled and tied with string. Behind them, a small metal box caught the light. But it was what lay scattered on the compartment floor that truly stunned her. Photographs. Black and white photographs of people she didn't recognize, stamped with dates from the 1940s and 1950s. "What did Grandpa Great hide?" Tommy asked, using his pet name for Morris. Sarah couldn't answer immediately. Her grandfather had been a quiet man, a retired accountant who'd spent his later years in this remote cabin, claiming he wanted peace and solitude. He'd never mentioned secrets or hidden compartments, yet here was evidence of something more complex than the simple life she'd believed he'd led. She reached for the closest roll of papers, her hands shaking as she untied the string. The documents inside were official-looking, covered in government seals and signatures. As her eyes adjusted to read in the flashlight's glow, certain words jumped out at her: classified, operation, relocated assets. "Mommy, you're making that face you make when Daddy's being weird," Tommy observed with the brutal honesty of a 7-year-old. Sarah forced a smile, but her mind was reeling. Whatever Grandfather Morris had hidden in this wall, it wasn't the simple family memorabilia she might have expected. These documents looked important, possibly dangerous. The metallic smell she'd noticed upon entering suddenly made sense. It wasn't just old pipes or forgotten tools. It was the smell of secrets that had been buried for far too long. The morning light filtered through the dusty cabin windows as Sarah stirred awake on the old couch, her back aching from the unforgiving cushions. The baby kicked restlessly, as if sensing her discomfort. She pressed a hand to her belly and listened to the unfamiliar sounds of the forest, birds calling through the pines, branches creaking in the wind, and something else. A rhythmic tapping that didn't belong to nature. She found Tommy in the back bedroom, kneeling beside the far wall with a small hammer he'd discovered in her grandfather's toolbox. His ear was pressed against the weathered wood paneling. "What are you doing, sweetheart?" "Listen, Mama." Tommy's eyes were bright with excitement. "It sounds different here." Sarah lowered herself carefully beside him, her pregnant belly making the movement awkward. She placed her palm against the wall where Tommy indicated. The wood felt hollow beneath her touch, and when she knocked gently, it produced a distinctly different sound than the solid sections nearby. "You're right. It does sound hollow." She ran her fingers along the edge of the panel, feeling for any irregularities. "How did you even think to check this?" "I was looking for treasure." Tommy's matter-of-fact tone made her smile despite their circumstances. Grandpa Great was really old, right? Old people always hide treasure. If only it were that simple. Sarah examined the panel more closely, noticing that the wood grain didn't quite match the surrounding boards. The seam was expertly concealed, but once she knew what to look for, she could trace the outline of what appeared to be a hidden door. Her phone buzzed with a text message. "Marcus again, bank called. Need to talk." "Where are you?" She silenced the phone without responding. Whatever conversation awaited her with Marcus would have to wait. The foreclosure notice gave them 30 days, but the debt collectors wouldn't be so patient. She needed answers, and this cabin might hold them. "Help me look for a way to open this, Tommy." They searched methodically, running their hands along the baseboards and checking for hidden latches or switches. Tommy's smaller fingers proved more adept at exploring the narrow gaps between boards. After 20 minutes, he let out a triumphant yelp. "I found something." His finger had located a small wooden peg, nearly invisible in the grain pattern, that pressed inward with a soft click. The panel swung open on hidden hinges, revealing a narrow space behind the wall. The hidden compartment was larger than Sarah had expected, extending several feet into what must have been dead space between rooms. Her grandfather had carved out a secret storage area, complete with wooden shelves and a small battery-powered light that somehow still functioned when Tommy accidentally triggered the switch. The shelves held an assortment of items that made no immediate sense together. Old leather journals, several thick manila envelopes, a wooden box with brass hinges, and what appeared to be surveyor's maps rolled and tied with string. Everything was meticulously organized and surprisingly well preserved. Sarah reached for the nearest journal, its leather cover soft with age. Her grandfather's familiar handwriting filled the pages in precise, measured script. The entries were dated, spanning several decades, but they weren't typical journal entries about daily life. Instead, they contained detailed observations about people, names, addresses, financial information, family connections, and in some cases, what appeared to be secrets. "What is all this stuff, Mama?" I'm not sure yet. Sarah's voice was barely above a whisper as she read entry after entry. Her grandfather had been documenting something, but the scope and purpose weren't immediately clear. Some names she recognized as locals from town, others were complete strangers. But the level of detail was unsettling. Bank account numbers, property deeds, records of affairs and business dealings that should have been private. She opened one of the manila envelopes and found photographs. Black and white images of people in compromising situations, business meetings, documents being exchanged. Her grandfather had been watching people, documenting their secrets. But why? Tommy had discovered the wooden box and was examining its brass lock. It's locked, but I think I can... Don't. Sarah's sharp tone made him freeze. We need to be careful with all of this. The implications were starting to sink in. Her grandfather, whom she'd remembered as a quiet, solitary man who lived simply in the mountains, had apparently maintained extensive surveillance on numerous people. This wasn't the innocent collection of an old man's memories. This was something else entirely. She unrolled one of the maps and spread it on the floor. It showed the local area in detail, but with handwritten notations marking specific properties, dates, and cryptic symbols she didn't recognize. Red X's marked several locations, including what appeared to be the exact spot where the cabin sat. The baby kicked hard, as if reacting to her rising anxiety. Whatever her grandfather had been involved in, it was complex and potentially dangerous, and now she and Tommy were sitting in the middle of it with nowhere else to go. Her phone buzzed again. This time it wasn't Marcus. The drive to grandfather's cabin stretched endlessly through winding mountain roads that Maya barely remembered from childhood visits. Each mile took them further from civilization, deeper into the kind of wilderness where cell towers were myths and the nearest neighbor lived behind miles of pine trees. Tommy had fallen asleep in his car seat an hour ago, his small face peaceful against the worn fabric, blissfully unaware that this wasn't just another family adventure. Maya's hands gripped the steering wheel tighter as another contraction rippled through her belly. She'd been timing them since leaving the city, still 20 minutes apart, but getting stronger. Dr. Chen had said she had at least 2 weeks, maybe 3, but babies had their own schedules. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was fleeing to a remote cabin while potentially going into early labor. The foreclosure notice crumpled in her purse seemed to mock her with every pothole. 60 days. That's all the time she had before the bank took everything. The house where Tommy had taken his first steps, where she'd planned to bring the new baby home. Marcus's life insurance had covered the funeral costs and little else. His medical bills had devoured their savings like a hungry beast, leaving her with impossible choices and a crushing weight of debt that seemed to multiply daily. Pine branches scraped against the car windows as the road narrowed to little more than a dirt path. Maya slowed, peering through the gathering dusk for the turnoff her grandfather had described in his letters. There, a weathered mailbox leaning at a precarious angle, the name Novak barely visible beneath years of mountain weather. The cabin materialized from the shadows like something from a fairy tale, though not necessarily the pleasant kind. 2 stories of dark wood and stone, with a wraparound porch that sagged slightly on one side. Windows stared down at them like sleepy eyes, reflecting the last rays of sunlight that managed to penetrate the thick canopy above. It was larger than Maya remembered, but then again she'd been 7 the last time she visited, before whatever family argument had severed her grandfather from their lives. "Mummy?" Tommy stirred as she turned off the engine, the sudden silence jarring after hours of road noise. "Are we here?" "We're here, sweetheart." Maya tried to inject enthusiasm into her voice. "Remember what I told you about grandfather's cabin? This is where we're going to stay for a while." Tommy pressed his nose against the window, breath fogging the glass. "It looks spooky." It did look spooky. Maya couldn't argue with a 4-year-old's honest assessment. The cabin sat in a clearing that felt too perfect, too deliberate, as if the trees had been convinced to step back rather than cut down. Shadows pooled in corners where the dying light couldn't reach, and somewhere in the distance an owl called with a sound that made her shiver. The key was exactly where grandfather's letter had promised, under the third loose board on the porch steps. Maya wondered how many people knew about that hiding spot, how many strangers might have wandered through the cabin in the months since his death. But the door opened smoothly, and the interior smelled only of wood polish and the faint lavender sachets her grandfather had always favored. Tommy raced ahead while Maya struggled with their suitcases, his excited voice echoing through rooms that seemed frozen in time. The furniture was exactly as she remembered, the stone fireplace dominating one wall, built-in bookshelves stretching to the ceiling, filled with volumes in 3 languages. Her grandfather's reading chair still sat by the window, a half-finished crossword puzzle folded neatly on the side table as if he'd just stepped out for tea. "Mom, come see!" Tommy's voice carried from somewhere upstairs, accompanied by the rapid thunder of small feet running across wooden floors. Maya followed the sound, her hand trailing along the banister that had been polished smooth by decades of use. The second floor held 3 bedrooms and a bathroom, with an enormous clawfoot tub that had fascinated her as a child. Tommy had claimed the room at the end of the hall, with windows facing the forest and wallpaper covered in faded sailing ships. "Look at all the boats," he said, spinning in a circle with his arms outstretched. "Can we go sailing, Mummy?" "There's no water here, baby, just trees." Maya sank onto the narrow bed, exhaustion hitting her like a physical weight. Another contraction gripped her, stronger this time, and she breathed through it while Tommy explored the closet that was bigger than his bedroom back home. Back in their former home, she corrected herself. This was home now, at least until she figured out what came next. The cabin was paid for, according to grandfather's letter, taxes current through the year. It wasn't much, but it was shelter, and it was theirs. Outside, night settled over the mountains with startling quickness, wrapping the cabin in darkness so complete it seemed solid. Maya made a mental note to find flashlights and candles before exploring further. Tomorrow, she'd start making plans. Tonight, they just needed to survive. The morning light filtered through the dusty cabin windows, casting long shadows across the worn wooden floor. Sarah's back ached as she shifted on the old couch where she'd spent a restless night, her mind churning over the contents of the metal box. The birth certificate with her grandfather's different name, the newspaper clipping about the missing family, the cryptic letter. None of it made sense, yet all of it felt dangerously important. Tommy was already awake, sitting cross-legged on the floor near the fireplace, turning one of the old photographs over in his small hands. He'd been unusually quiet since their discovery, his 7-year-old mind clearly working through questions he didn't know how to ask. "Mama, why did Great-Grandpa have different names?" he asked without looking up. Sarah struggled to her feet, her pregnant belly making the simple movement awkward. "I don't know, sweetheart. Sometimes grown-ups have reasons for things that are hard to understand." It was a weak answer, and Tommy's skeptical glance told her he knew it. She moved to the kitchen area, hoping to find something resembling breakfast in the sparse cabinets. The baby kicked restlessly, responding to her anxiety. The sound of an approaching vehicle made them both freeze. Through the front window, Sarah watched a dark pickup truck navigate the rutted dirt road leading to the cabin. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she recognized the vehicle. It belonged to Dale Morrison, Marcus's friend and fellow repo man. "Tommy, go to the back room," she whispered urgently, gathering the contents of the metal box. "Now!" The boy's eyes widened, but he obeyed without question, slipping away as Sarah shoved the documents under a couch cushion. The truck's engine cut off, followed by the slam of a door and heavy footsteps on the cabin's front porch. 3 sharp knocks echoed through the small space. "Sarah? I know you're in there. Your car's outside." She recognized Dale's gravelly voice and forced herself to breathe normally before opening the door. Dale stood on the porch, his weathered face wearing an expression of forced sympathy. Behind him, she noticed another man waiting by the truck, someone she didn't recognize. "Dale, what are you doing here?" "Looking for you," Honorable Marcus is worried sick. "You disappeared without a word, and with the baby coming." He gestured toward her belly. "This ain't safe, Sarah. You need to come home. How did you know where to find me? Dale's eyes shifted slightly. Marcus remembered you mentioning your grandfather's place. Took some asking around, but we tracked it down. He stepped closer to the doorway. Look, I get that you two had a fight, but running off like this? It wasn't just a fight. Sarah kept her voice steady despite the fear crawling up her throat. Marcus hit me, Dale. He's been getting worse, and I won't let him hurt Tommy or the baby. Dale's expression didn't change, which told her everything she needed to know about how much Marcus had shared with his friend. Sometimes couples go through rough patches, especially with money troubles and a baby on the way. Stress makes people do things they don't mean. Get off my property. The words came out with more strength than Sarah felt. Dale's eyebrows rose slightly. Your property? Sarah, honey, you don't own this place. This cabin belongs to the Morrison County Land Trust. Has for about 15 years now, since the previous owner defaulted on back taxes. His smile was cold. Technically, you're trespassing. The ground seemed to shift beneath Sarah's feet. Morrison County Land Trust. Morrison. Dale's family had money, owned businesses throughout the county. The coincidence felt too sharp, too deliberate. You're lying. Check the county records if you want. But right now you need to gather your things and come with us. Marcus is waiting. From inside the cabin came the sound of something falling, followed by Tommy's excited voice. Mama! There's a door back here! Behind the wall! Dale's expression sharpened instantly. What's the boy found? Sarah's mind raced. Whatever Tommy had discovered, she couldn't let Dale see it. Not when everything about this situation felt wrong. Dale's sudden appearance, his claim about the land ownership, the stranger waiting by the truck who kept checking his watch like they were on some kind of schedule. Nothing. He's just playing. She stepped onto the porch and pulled the door shut behind her. Give me 5 minutes to get our things. Dale studied her face carefully. 5 minutes. Then we're leaving. He paused. Oh, and Sarah? Don't try anything stupid. There's nowhere to run out here, and like I said, you're trespassing on private property. Wouldn't want to have to involve the sheriff. Sarah nodded and went back inside, her hands shaking as she closed the door. Through the thin walls she could hear Dale talking quietly to his companion, their voices too low to make out words but urgent in tone. Whatever Tommy had found behind that wall, she had a sinking feeling it was connected to the secrets in her grandfather's box, and that Dale Morrison already knew more about both than he was letting on. The hidden room stretched deeper than Sarah had imagined, extending beneath what must have been the kitchen above. Her flashlight beams swept across walls lined with metal filing cabinets, their surfaces dulled by decades of mountain humidity. The air tasted of old paper and something else, something chemical that made her nose wrinkle. Stay close to me, Tommy, she whispered, one hand instinctively moving to her rounded belly as the baby shifted restlessly inside her. Tommy nodded, his earlier excitement tempered by the room's oppressive atmosphere. Dust motes danced in the flashlight beam like tiny ghosts as they moved deeper into the space. Sarah's phone had lost all signal the moment they descended into the hidden room, cutting them off from the outside world. The first filing cabinet she tried was locked, but the second opened with a protesting screech of rusted hinges. Inside, manila folders hung in neat rows, each labeled with dates spanning from 1962 to 1984. Sarah pulled out a folder at random, March 1971, and found herself staring at photographs that made her blood run cold. The images showed the surrounding forest, but it looked different somehow, scarred. Large sections of trees were bare, their branches skeletal against grey skies. In several photos, men in hazmat suits moved through the devastation carrying equipment she didn't recognize. Her grandfather appeared in 3 of the images, younger but unmistakably him, standing beside a man in a military uniform. Mama, look at this. Tommy had wandered to a corner where a desk sat covered by a paint-stained tarp. Beneath it, he'd discovered what appeared to be a radio setup, not the kind for music, but something more sophisticated. Multiple dials, frequencies marked in her grandfather's careful handwriting, and a logbook filled with entries that made little sense to her. Sarah flipped through the logbook while Tommy explored a stack of boxes nearby. Entry after entry detailed weather patterns, wind directions, and something called dispersal rates. The final entry was dated just 2 weeks before her grandfather's death. They know I kept records. Moving everything to the cabin. If something happens to me, Sarah needs to know the truth about Millfield. Millfield. The name hit her like a physical blow. She'd grown up in Millfield, lived there until she was 8 when her parents had suddenly decided to move across the country. They'd never explained why, just packed up one day and left everything behind. Her grandfather had visited them exactly once after the move, and she remembered how her parents had argued with him in hushed voices after they thought she'd gone to bed. "Mama, there's something weird in this box." Tommy held up a glass vial filled with dark liquid. Sarah's heart lurched as she saw there were dozens more, all carefully labeled with dates and locations around Millfield. Her hands shook as she read the labels: school playground, east corner; municipal water treatment facility, intake valve; hospital parking lot, storm drain. A manila envelope fell from between the files as she searched frantically for more information. Inside were medical records, not hers, but dozens of others. Children's records from Millfield General Hospital, all showing the same pattern of symptoms that meant nothing to her medically, but painted a horrifying picture when viewed together. Respiratory problems, unusual cancers, birth defects. The dates corresponded with the photographs of the damaged forest. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text message that had somehow found its way through despite the lack of signal bars. "Unknown number. You shouldn't be there. Leave now. Tommy, we need to go, right now." But Tommy wasn't listening. He'd found something else, hidden behind the radio equipment. A tape recorder, old-fashioned and heavy. Without waiting for permission, he pressed play. Her grandfather's voice filled the underground room, crackling with static, but unmistakably his. "If you're hearing this, Sarah, then I'm dead, and you've found my insurance policy. What I'm about to tell you will be hard to hear, but you need to understand what we did, what I helped them do to that town, to those children." Sarah sank into the desk chair. Tommy pressed close against her side as the recording continued. "In 1962, I was a young engineer working for a military contractor. We were testing chemical dispersal methods in remote areas, but someone decided Millfield was perfect for the next phase: rural, isolated, expendable. I helped design the delivery system, thinking it was for agricultural research. I didn't know until it was too late that we were poisoning an entire community." The baby kicked hard against Sarah's ribs, as if reacting to the horror in her grandfather's voice. The cancer rates, the birth defects, the respiratory problems, that was us. That was me. And when I tried to stop it, they buried the evidence and transferred the operation. But I kept records. I documented everything, and now they know I did. Another text message: "Leave the cabin. Don't make us come get you." Sarah's blood turned to ice as she heard footsteps on the cabin floor above them. The foundation stones felt ice-cold against Sarah's fingertips as she knelt in the dirt beside Tommy, who was already clawing at the loose mortar with the determination of a child on a treasure hunt. The beam of her flashlight revealed what he had discovered: a deliberate gap in the stonework, cleverly concealed behind years of accumulated debris and overgrown weeds. "Mom, look," Tommy whispered, his voice trembling with excitement as he pulled away chunks of crumbling mortar. "There's something back there, something metal." Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs as she helped him clear the opening. The baby shifted restlessly inside her, as if sensing her mounting anxiety. Through the widening gap, the flashlight beam caught the dull gleam of a metal box wedged deep within the foundation's hollow space. "Careful, sweetheart," she murmured, though her own hands shook as she reached into the dark cavity. The box was heavier than expected, roughly the size of a shoebox, but made of sturdy steel with a simple latch that had somehow survived decades of moisture and neglect. They sat back against the cabin's wall, the box resting between them like a silent oracle. Sarah's mind raced with possibilities and fears. Everything about this place felt wrong, from the too-clean interior to the neighbors' strange warnings to now this hidden cache. Her grandfather had been a simple man, or so she'd always believed, a quiet farmer who'd left her this property as a final gift. But simple men didn't hide metal boxes in secret compartments. Tommy's small fingers traced the box's edges. "Are we gonna open it?" Sarah hesitated. Once opened, whatever lay inside couldn't be unknown again. Yet with Mark's gambling debts crushing them and the baby coming, she couldn't afford to ignore any potential salvation, no matter how mysterious its origin. The latch clicked open with surprising ease. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth that had protected them from decades of dampness, lay documents. Lots of them. Sarah lifted the first bundle with trembling hands, unfolding papers that revealed typewritten text in multiple languages. Some she recognized as German and Russian, others completely foreign. Official-looking stamps and seals decorated many pages, along with photographs of people she didn't recognize. But it was the second bundle that made her blood turn to ice. Bank statements, dozens of them, spanning from the 1940s through the 1980s, showing regular deposits of substantial amounts. The account holder's name was listed as Heinrich Kohler, not the Samuel Walker she'd known as her grandfather. The amounts were staggering, enough to have made him a wealthy man many times over. "Mom?" Tommy's voice seemed to come from very far away. "What's wrong? You look sick." Sarah forced herself to breathe as she rifled through more documents, birth certificates with different names, immigration papers that told a story of a man fleeing Europe in 1947, not the patriotic American farmer she'd grown up hearing stories about. And photographs, Heinrich Kohler in uniform, standing beside men whose faces she recognized from history books about the war, the wrong side of the war. Her hands found a leather journal at the bottom of the box, its pages filled with her grandfather's familiar handwriting, but written in German. She couldn't read most of it, but scattered English phrases jumped out at her. "The gold must remain hidden. If they find me, my granddaughter must never know." Tommy leaned closer, studying a photograph that had fallen from the journal's pages. "Mom, is this Grandpa Sam? He looks different." The man in the photograph wore a Nazi uniform. Young and proud, he stood beside what appeared to be stacks of artwork and valuables. On the back, someone had written in faded ink, "Heinrich France, 1943. Sarah's world tilted sideways. The grandfather who had bounced her on his knee, who had taught her to fish and told her stories about American heroes, had been someone else entirely. Someone whose past was apparently dark enough to require hiding his very identity for over 40 years. But it was the final document that made her stomach lurch. A hand-drawn map of the property, marking several locations with X's and dated just months before her grandfather's death. Notes in the margins referenced insurance and final arrangements. One location was marked as emergency, only with an arrow pointing to what appeared to be the basement of the cabin. The basement they hadn't yet explored. Tommy touched her arm. "Mom, are you crying?" She hadn't realized tears were streaming down her face. The grandfather she'd loved had been a lie, but the money, God help her, she couldn't ignore the money. Those bank statements suggested wealth hidden somewhere, wealth that could solve every problem she faced. The baby kicked hard, as if protesting the moral complexity of her thoughts. "We need to go back inside," she whispered, gathering the documents with shaking hands. "We need to find the basement." Tommy nodded solemnly, seeming to understand that their lives had just changed in ways neither of them could fully grasp yet. Behind them, the mountain wind whistled through the trees, carrying secrets that had been buried for far too long. The hidden room stretched deeper than Sarah had imagined, its walls lined with metal filing cabinets that seemed to go on forever in the dim light of her flashlight. The musty air carried an undertone of something else, chemicals maybe, or old medicine. Tommy pressed close to her side, his small hand gripping her jacket as they stepped across the threshold. "What is this place, Mummy?" he whispered, his voice barely audible in the oppressive silence. Sarah didn't answer immediately. She couldn't. The beam of her flashlight swept across the nearest filing cabinet, revealing yellowed labels written in her grandfather's precise handwriting. Dates, names, case numbers. Her heart hammered against her ribs as the implications began to sink in. She pulled open the first drawer with trembling fingers. Manila folders, dozens of them, each thick with documentation. She pulled one out at random and opened it to reveal photographs. Black and white images of a young woman lying on what appeared to be an examination table. Medical notes were clipped to the photos, written in multiple hands, detailing procedures Sarah didn't recognize. "We should go back," Tommy said, tugging at her jacket. "I don't like it here." But Sarah couldn't move. She flipped through more folders, each one revealing similar contents. Women, all young, all appearing unconscious or sedated. Some of the medical terminology was beyond her understanding, but certain phrases jumped out. Subject responded well to treatment. Procedure completed successfully. Patient showed no memory of intervention. The baby kicked hard against her ribs, as if sensing her distress. She pressed a hand to her stomach, her mind racing. Her grandfather had been a respected doctor in the community, known for his gentle manner and dedication to his patients. This couldn't be what it appeared to be. There had to be an explanation. She moved to the next cabinet, this one containing what appeared to be financial records. Bank statements, payment receipts, correspondence with pharmaceutical companies. The amounts were staggering. Thousands of dollars changing hands, with cryptic notations in the margins. Her grandfather's signature appeared on document after document, authorizing payments she couldn't begin to understand. "Mummy, look." Tommy had wandered to the far corner of the room, where a smaller desk sat against the wall. On its surface lay an open journal, its pages yellow with age. Sarah approached the desk with growing dread. The journal was filled with her grandfather's handwriting, but this wasn't the careful script she remembered from birthday cards and letters. This writing was hurried, sometimes illegible, as if the thoughts were pouring out faster than his hand could record them. She began to read, her flashlight beam dancing across the pages. The entries were dated, starting from decades ago and continuing almost until his death. They detailed experiments, that was the only word for them, conducted on young women who had come to him for routine medical care. Unmarried women mostly, poor women, women who wouldn't be believed if they ever remembered what had happened to them. The room seemed to tilt around her as she read. Her grandfather had been using his practice as a cover, conducting unauthorized medical research funded by pharmaceutical companies who needed test subjects for experimental drugs and procedures. The women had been sedated, subjected to various treatments, then given memory-suppressing medication to ensure they wouldn't remember the experience. "We're helping advance medical science," one entry read. "These women are contributing to breakthroughs that will save countless lives. They should be honored to participate, even if they don't know it." Sarah's hands shook as she turned the pages. The entries became more erratic toward the end, filled with paranoia and justification. Her grandfather had begun to suspect that someone was investigating him, that his carefully constructed operation was being exposed. The final entry was dated just weeks before his death. "They're getting close. If anything happens to me, the truth dies with me. Sarah will inherit the cabin. She'll never know. My legacy will remain intact." Tommy tugged at her sleeve again, more insistently this time. "Mummy, there's someone outside." Sarah's blood turned to ice. She strained her ears and heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps on the cabin's front porch. Slow, deliberate steps, as if someone was trying not to be heard. She quickly closed the journal and grabbed Tommy's hand. "We need to hide," she whispered, pulling him behind one of the larger filing cabinets. The footsteps entered the cabin, moving through the front room where they had been sitting just minutes before. Sarah could hear drawers being opened, papers being shuffled. Whoever it was, they were searching for something specific. The baby pressed against her bladder, and she had to bite her lip to keep from gasping. Tommy's eyes were wide with fear, but he remained silent, pressed against her side in their hiding spot. The searcher was getting closer, moving toward the bedroom where the hidden door stood open like a beacon. Sarah closed her eyes and prayed that whoever it was wouldn't think to look behind the walls. The morning light filtered through the cabin's dusty windows as Sarah carefully examined the documents they'd found behind the hidden wall. Her hands trembled slightly as she spread the papers across the kitchen table, creating a timeline that made her stomach churn. Tommy sat beside her, unusually quiet, his small fingers tracing the edges of photographs that showed faces eerily similar to their own. "Mama, why does this lady look like you?" Tommy pointed to a black-and-white photograph of a young woman standing beside a man in a military uniform. The resemblance was undeniable. The same dark eyes, the same stubborn jawline that Sarah recognized in her own mirror. "I don't know, sweetheart." Sarah's voice caught as she read the name written on the back, Eleanor Whitmore, 1952. Her grandfather's handwriting was unmistakable, but the surname wasn't one she recognized from any family stories. She'd grown up believing her grandmother died when her father was young, that there were no other relatives, no extended family to speak of. The documents painted a different picture entirely. Birth certificates, marriage licenses, even what appeared to be adoption papers, all bearing names and dates that contradicted everything her father had told her about their family history. According to these papers, her grandfather hadn't been born James Hartley at all. His real name was James Whitmore, and he'd legally changed it in 1955. Sarah's phone buzzed against the table, making her jump. Marcus's name appeared on the screen, and she hesitated before answering. Their last conversation had ended badly, with him demanding she come home immediately and her refusing to abandon what might be their only hope. "Sarah, thank God." His voice was strained, exhausted. "Listen, something's happened. That man, Garrett, he came by the house again last night. He wasn't alone this time." Her blood ran cold. "What do you mean he wasn't alone?" "3 men, maybe 4. They didn't break in, but they were watching the house for hours. Mrs. Chen from next door called the police, but by the time they arrived, the men were gone." Marcus paused, and she could hear him moving around, probably pacing like he did when he was anxious. "Sarah, I think we're in real danger here. Whatever your grandfather was involved in, these people aren't going to just disappear." Tommy looked up at her with wide eyes, picking up on the tension in her voice. She forced herself to speak calmly. "Did the police find anything? Any evidence?" "Tire tracks, nothing more. But Sarah, they left something behind. An envelope with your name on it, tucked under our front door." Marcus's voice dropped to almost a whisper. "I haven't opened it. I was waiting to talk to you first." Sarah closed her eyes, feeling the weight of the baby pressing against her ribs as she leaned back in the chair. Every instinct told her to pack up immediately, to take Tommy and run as far as possible from whatever web of secrets her grandfather had left behind. But the documents spread before her suggested that running might not be enough, that whatever this was, it was too deeply rooted in her family's past to simply escape. "Open it," she said finally, "but put me on speaker so I can hear." She listened to the sound of paper tearing, then Marcus's sharp intake of breath. "Sarah, it's a copy of a bank statement, an account in the Cayman Islands with your grandfather's name on it. The balance—" He paused. "Jesus, Sarah, there's over $2 million in this account." The room seemed to spin around her. $2 million would solve every problem they faced: the medical bills, the mortgage, Tommy's future. But money that had been hidden away for decades, connected to men who threatened families in the middle of the night, couldn't possibly come without strings attached. "There's a note too," Marcus continued. "It says, 'Your grandfather made promises he couldn't keep. You can honor them or face the consequences. We'll be in touch.'" Tommy tugged at her sleeve. "Mama, are you okay? You look sick." She realized she'd been holding her breath and forced herself to exhale slowly. Around her, the cabin suddenly felt less like a refuge and more like a trap. The walls seemed to press closer, heavy with decades of secrets that were now hers to bear. "Marcus, I need you to pack a bag and take it to your sister's house. Don't tell anyone where you're going, and don't go straight there. Drive around first, make sure you're not being followed. What about you and Tommy? Sarah looked down at the documents, then at her son's trusting face. Whatever her grandfather had been involved in, whatever promises he'd made, the answers weren't in Marcus's hands or in some bank account thousands of miles away. They were here, in this cabin, waiting to be discovered. "We're going to finish what we started," she said. "And then we're going to end this once and for all." The photograph trembled in Sarah's hands as she stared at the face that couldn't possibly be there. Her grandfather stood beside a woman she didn't recognize, both of them young and smiling, but it was the third figure that made her blood run cold. The man on the left bore an unmistakable resemblance to Detective Morrison, the same angular jaw, the same piercing eyes, even the same slight scar above the left eyebrow. "Mom?" Tommy's voice seemed to come from far away. "You look really pale." Sarah couldn't speak. The implications crashed over her like waves, each one more devastating than the last. Morrison hadn't been assigned to her case randomly. He'd known exactly who she was from the moment she'd walked into that police station, reporting David's disappearance. But why hadn't he said anything? And what did his connection to her grandfather mean for David? She flipped the photograph over with shaking fingers. In faded pencil, someone had written, "Henry, Margaret and James, last day at the mine, 1962. Henry was her grandfather's name, which meant James could be Morrison's father, or perhaps Morrison himself was older than he appeared. "We need to leave," Sarah whispered, then louder, more urgent. "Tommy, we need to leave right now." "But Mom, there's more stuff back there. I found—" "Now." The sharpness in her voice made Tommy jump. She stuffed the photograph into her pocket and grabbed his hand, pulling him toward the cabin's front door. Her mind raced as they moved. If Morrison was connected to her grandfather, then he knew about this place. He might already be on his way here. As they stepped onto the porch, the sound of tires crunching on gravel made Sarah's heart stop. Through the trees, she could see a dark sedan approaching on the narrow access road. There was nowhere to run. Their car was parked right next to the cabin, visible to anyone coming up the drive. "Back inside," she hissed, reversing direction, pushing Tommy through the door. The hidden room. Quickly. They scrambled through the cabin and into the secret space behind the wall. Sarah pulled the panel closed just as she heard car doors slamming outside. Her phone had no signal this deep in the woods, and she cursed herself for not thinking to call for help while she still could. Heavy footsteps crossed the porch, and the front door creaked open. Sarah held Tommy close, feeling his small body trembling against hers. Through a tiny gap in the wall panel, she could see into the main room of the cabin. Detective Morrison stepped into view, but he wasn't alone. A second man followed, older, heavy-set, with salt-and-pepper hair and cold eyes. Sarah had never seen him before, but something about his presence radiated danger. "She's been here," Morrison said, examining the disturbed dust on the table where Sarah had spread out the documents. "Recently," the older man grunted. "Find what she took. We can't afford any loose ends, not after all these years." Morrison moved toward the hidden room, and Sarah's breath caught in her throat. But instead of discovering their hiding spot, he began examining the remaining documents on the desk inside. "Most of the mining records are still here," he called out. "Some of the photographs are missing, though." "Damn it," the older man swore. "Henry always was too sentimental, keeping all this evidence. Should have burned it decades ago. What about the woman and the boy?" "They know too much now." First, the husband starts digging around, asking questions about the old mining operations, and now she's here. The whole family's become a liability. Sarah's blood turned to ice. David had been investigating something connected to this place before he disappeared, and now she understood why Morrison had seemed so interested in her family, why he'd been asking such specific questions about her grandfather. Tommy shifted beside her, and she pressed her hand gently over his mouth, praying he would stay quiet. The older man was walking around the cabin now, his footsteps heavy and deliberate. "We'll wait," Morrison said. "She'll come back for her car, and when she does, we'll be ready. This ends tonight. What about the boy?" Morrison paused, and in that silence, Sarah heard everything she needed to know about what these men were capable of. She closed her eyes, thinking desperately. There had to be another way out of this room, some escape route her grandfather had built into his hiding place. As quietly as possible, she began feeling along the walls in the darkness, searching for any kind of opening or hidden door. Her fingers found something, a loose board near the floor of the back wall. Behind it, she could feel air movement, as if there was a space beyond. The men's voices continued in the main room as they settled in to wait. Sarah worked frantically but silently at the loose board, knowing that their lives now depended on whatever escape route her grandfather had been wise enough to build into his secret room all those years ago. The silence that followed Tommy's words felt like the cabin itself was holding its breath. Sarah stared at her son, then at the narrow opening in the wall, her mind struggling to process what he'd just said. Someone else was down there. Someone alive. Tommy, are you absolutely certain? Her voice came out as barely a whisper. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. Every instinct screamed at her to grab Tommy and run. But where could they go? The storm still raged outside, and her grandfather's truck had refused to start that morning. They were trapped here with whatever, or whoever, lurked beneath the cabin. She pulled Tommy close, feeling the rapid flutter of the baby's movement in response to her elevated stress. Think, Sarah. Think like Grandpa would have. He was always methodical, always prepared. Did you see anything else down there? Any other way out? There's a tunnel. It goes in two directions from a big room. One way has the light, and the other way— Tommy scrunched his face, remembering. The other way smells like outside air, an escape route. Of course her grandfather would have built an escape route. Sarah moved to the kitchen window and peered through the rain-lashed glass. The storm showed no signs of letting up, but more troubling were the fresh tire tracks she could now make out in the muddy driveway. Someone had been here recently, someone who might still be here. Tommy, I need you to listen very carefully. She knelt before him, gripping his shoulders gently but firmly. We're going to go down into that passage, but we're going to be very, very quiet. Can you do that for me? He nodded solemnly, understanding the gravity in her voice. Sarah gathered supplies quickly, the remaining bottled water, granola bars, her grandfather's heavy flashlight, and the pistol she'd found in his bedroom drawer. Her hands shook as she checked the clip. 6 bullets. She prayed it would be enough, or better yet, that she wouldn't need to find out. They approached the hidden opening together. Sarah went first, lowering herself through the narrow gap with considerable difficulty given her pregnant belly. Tommy followed, his small frame easily navigating the space that had clearly been designed with a child in mind. The passage was larger than she'd expected, carved directly into the rock foundation with rough-hewn wooden supports. The air smelled of earth and age, with an underlying metallic scent that made her stomach turn. Tommy pointed toward the left branch of the tunnel, where a faint glow emanated from somewhere in the distance. They moved toward the light, their footsteps muffled by what felt like decades of accumulated dust. As they drew closer, Sarah could hear it too, the soft sound of movement and something else. Typing. Someone was typing on a keyboard. The tunnel opened into a small underground chamber, carved from living rock. Electric cables snaked along the walls, powering a series of camping lanterns and what appeared to be some kind of communication equipment. A man sat with his back to them at a makeshift desk, his fingers moving across a laptop keyboard. Sarah raised the pistol with trembling hands, even as her mind reeled at the impossibility of what she was seeing. This wasn't some random intruder. This was an elaborate setup, something that had been planned and maintained for years. "Don't move," she said, her voice stronger than she felt. The man's typing stopped, but he didn't turn around. When he spoke, his voice was calm, almost resigned. "Hello, Sarah. I've been waiting for you to find this place." The familiarity of his tone sent ice through her veins. "Turn around." Slowly. He complied, rotating the chair until she could see his face in the lamplight. Sarah's world tilted on its axis. The man before her was perhaps 60, with graying hair and weathered features, But his eyes, those were her grandfather's eyes, her grandfather's nose. The family resemblance was unmistakable. "My name is David Winters," he said quietly. "I'm your grandfather's brother, your great-uncle, and I'm very sorry you had to discover this place." "That's impossible," Sarah breathed. "Grandpa never mentioned a brother." "There's a lot Henry never mentioned." David's gaze moved to Tommy, who had pressed himself against Sarah's leg. "The question now is what we're going to do about it, because the people I've been hiding from, the people who killed your grandfather, they're coming, and they'll be here before morning." The baby kicked hard against Sarah's ribs, and she fought a wave of dizziness. Nothing made sense anymore. Her grandfather was murdered. This stranger claimed to be family, and now they were all in danger from some unnamed threat. "I don't understand any of this," she managed. David stood slowly, hands visible and empty. "Then it's time you learned the truth about the Winters family, Sarah. All of it. Because your son's discovery of this place just activated a beacon. They know where we are now." The storm outside had intensified, wind howling through the cabin's weathered boards like the wails of long-buried secrets demanding to be heard. Maya sat cross-legged on the floor, her pregnancy making the position uncomfortable, but she couldn't move away from the scattered documents that painted her grandfather in an entirely different light. Tommy pressed closer to her side, his small fingers tracing the edges of a black-and-white photograph. "Mama, why does Grandpa Great look so serious in all these pictures?" Maya studied the image, her grandfather Edmund standing beside men in dark suits outside what appeared to be a government building. The stamp on the back read 1962, Operation Blue Jay, classified. Her hands trembled as she set it aside and reached for another folder, this one containing correspondence between Edmund and someone identified only as Agent Blackwood. "Your grandfather was involved in things we never knew about, sweetheart," she whispered, more to herself than to Tommy. Each document revealed another layer of deception. Edmund hadn't been the simple mountain man she'd remembered from her childhood visits. He'd been something else entirely, something dangerous. A sudden crack of thunder made them both jump, but it was followed by another sound that made Maya's blood freeze. Footsteps on the front porch, heavy, deliberate steps that suggested someone was trying to be quiet but failing. "Tommy, go to the back room," she hissed, gathering the most important documents. "Take these and hide under the bed. Don't come out no matter what you hear." "But Mama..." "Go, now." The front door handle rattled. Maya's heart hammered against her ribs as she realized she'd forgotten to throw the deadbolt. In one fluid motion, she heaved herself to her feet and lunged for the door, her pregnant belly throwing off her balance. Her fingers had just grasped the lock when the door burst inward, sending her stumbling backward. Two figures in dark rain gear stepped inside, water dripping from their coats onto the cabin's worn floorboards. The taller one pulled back his hood, revealing a weathered face with cold grey eyes that seemed to catalogue everything in the room instantly. "Miss Chen," he said, his voice carrying a slight southern accent. "I'm Agent Morrison, FBI. This is Agent Vale. We need to talk." Maya's hand instinctively moved to her belly. "How did you find us? What do you want?" Agent Vale, a woman with sharp features and prematurely grey hair, stepped forward. "Your grandfather left some unfinished business that apparently didn't die with him." Her gaze fell on the papers scattered across the floor. "I see you've been doing some reading." "I don't know what you're talking about," Maya lied, hoping her voice sounded steadier than she felt. The baby kicked hard, as if sensing the danger. Morrison moved deeper into the cabin, his trained eyes taking in every detail. "Edmund Hartwell wasn't your grandfather's real name. Did you know that? He was Edmund Kozlov, a Soviet agent who defected in 1961. The CIA gave him a new identity, set him up here in the mountains where he could disappear." The words hit Maya like physical blows. Soviet agent, defector, new identity. Everything she thought she knew about her family history crumbled in an instant. "That's impossible," she breathed. "He was born in Tennessee. He told me stories about growing up here, about his father building this cabin. Stories, Vale interrupted. All carefully constructed lies. Edmund was very good at his job, even after he switched sides. Too good, apparently. Because when he died, we thought his secrets died with him. But then strange things started happening. Bank accounts we'd never traced suddenly became active. Dead drops that had been cold for decades showed signs of activity. Maya backed toward the hallway, her mind racing. Behind one of these walls, Tommy was hiding with documents that might be the key to everything. She had to protect him, had to keep these agents from discovering what they'd found. "I don't know anything about bank accounts or dead drops," she said. "I just came here because I needed somewhere safe to stay. I'm pregnant. I lost my job. My husband left." Morrison held up a hand. "We know about your circumstances, Ms. Chen, and we're not unsympathetic, but your grandfather hid something in this cabin, something that could compromise ongoing operations and put lives at risk. We need to find it." "He's been dead for 5 years, Maya protested. "Whatever secrets he had died with him." Vale pulled out a tablet, swiped to a photograph, and turned it toward Maya. The image showed the cabin's exterior, but the timestamp was from just 3 days ago. Someone had been watching this place, waiting. "Your grandfather may be dead," Vale said quietly, "but his network isn't. And they know you're here." Another flash of lightning illuminated the cabin's interior, and in that brief moment of harsh white light, Maya saw something that made her blood turn to ice. Through the window, barely visible through the driving rain, was the silhouette of someone standing at the edge of the tree line. They weren't alone. The photographs scattered across the floor like fallen leaves, each one a window into a world Sarah never knew existed. Her hands trembled as she picked up image after image. Her grandfather, as a young man in a military uniform she didn't recognize, standing beside men whose faces had been carefully scratched out with black ink. "Mama, look at this one." Tommy held up a photograph that made Sarah's breath catch. It showed her grandfather shaking hands with a man in an expensive suit, both of them standing in front of what appeared to be a government building. The timestamp read 1962. Sarah sank to her knees, the weight of her pregnancy suddenly overwhelming. The baby kicked sharply against her ribs as if sensing her distress. "Tommy, we need to be very careful with these. They're important." But Tommy had already moved on to something else. Behind where the photographs had been stored, his small fingers had found another loose board. This one came away easily, revealing a metal box no larger than a shoebox. "There's more stuff, Mama." Sarah crawled over, her back aching with each movement. The metal box was locked, but the key hung from a small chain attached to the handle, her grandfather's way of hiding things in plain sight. Her fingers fumbled with the tiny lock until it clicked open. Inside, nestled in faded red velvet, lay a collection of items that made no sense together. A passport with her grandfather's photo but a name she'd never heard, Marcus Volkov, several rolls of cash bound with rubber bands, and a small leather journal filled with her grandfather's careful handwriting. Sarah opened the journal to a random page and began to read. The words swam before her eyes, each sentence more impossible than the last. Her grandfather hadn't been the simple carpenter she'd grown up believing him to be. According to these pages, he'd been something else entirely, something dangerous. "Mama, your face is all white." Tommy's voice seemed to come from very far away. The journal detailed meetings, payments, and what could only be described as assignments. Names of people she'd never heard of were listed alongside dates and locations. Some entries were written in what appeared to be code, but others were disturbingly clear. "Package delivered to Chicago contact." "Family believes heart attack story." "Payment received." Sarah's vision blurred. The implications crashed over her like a cold wave. Her grandfather, the man who had taught her to fish, who had carved her wooden toys, who had been the gentlest person in her childhood. Had he been some kind of criminal? The passport suggested he'd been living under a false identity her entire life. "Tommy, come here. Come sit with Mama." Her son obediently crawled over and settled against her side. She needed his warmth, his innocent presence, to anchor her to reality. The journal felt heavy in her hands, weighted with secrets that had died with her grandfather, or so she'd thought. She flipped to the final entries, dated just weeks before his death. Her own name appeared on the page, causing her heart to skip. Sarah must never know the truth about the family. The debts I owe will die with me. Dmitri has given his word. The cabin will be enough to keep her safe if she ever needs it. Dmitri. The name felt familiar, tugging at a memory she couldn't quite grasp. Then it hit her, the man who had been calling, the one Marcus had been so nervous about. The pieces began clicking together in a pattern that terrified her. "Mama, you're squeezing too tight." Sarah loosened her grip on Tommy and forced herself to breathe. Whatever her grandfather had been involved in, whoever Dmitri was, they were connected to her present situation. The calls, Marcus's fear, the urgent need for money, it was all part of something much larger than she'd understood. She turned to the very last page of the journal. In her grandfather's familiar handwriting were instructions, detailed directions to something hidden even deeper within the cabin. GPS coordinates, measurements, references to the real insurance policy. The baby gave another sharp kick, and Sarah winced. She was running out of time in more ways than one. Marcus would expect her back soon, and she still didn't have the money they desperately needed. But now she had something potentially more valuable and infinitely more dangerous. "Tommy, we're going to play one more game, okay? We're going treasure hunters, and Grandpa Great left us a very important map." She struggled to her feet, using the wall for support. Whatever her grandfather had hidden, whatever insurance policy he'd referred to, she had to find it. The journal made it clear that the debts he'd thought would die with him were very much alive. Dmitri hadn't forgotten, and now those debts might have transferred to her. The coordinates led outside to a spot somewhere behind the cabin. Sarah looked toward the window where shadows were growing longer. Time was running out, but she had no choice. Her family's survival might depend on uncovering the last of her grandfather's buried secrets. The morning light filtered through the cabin's dusty windows as Sarah stared at the documents spread across the kitchen table. Her hands trembled as she reread the adoption papers for the third time, each word feeling like a physical blow. Marcus Thompson wasn't her grandfather. He was the man who had orchestrated the cover-up of her real identity. Tommy sat quietly in the corner, his small fingers tracing patterns in the dust on the windowsill. He hadn't spoken much since they'd discovered the hidden room, as if he sensed the weight of what they'd uncovered. Sarah's pregnancy made every emotion more intense, and she fought against the nausea that wasn't entirely from morning sickness. The sound of gravel crunching outside made them both freeze. Sarah quickly gathered the papers, stuffing them behind the loose board where Tommy had found them. Through the window, she watched a black sedan pull up beside their rental car. Two figures emerged, a woman in a dark coat and a man she recognized with a chill that ran down her spine. "Detective Morrison." "Tommy, go to the back room," she whispered urgently. "Stay quiet, no matter what you hear." Her son's eyes widened with fear, but he obeyed without question. Sarah smoothed her shirt over her growing belly and walked to the door, trying to compose herself before the knock came. "Miss Chen," Detective Morrison's voice carried through the wood. "We need to talk." Sarah opened the door slowly, keeping her body positioned to block their view of the interior. "Detective, I wasn't expecting anyone." The woman beside him stepped forward. She was older, maybe 60, with steel-grey hair and eyes that seemed to catalogue every detail. "My name is Eleanor Blackwood. I believe you've been asking questions about Marcus Thompson." The name hit Sarah like ice water. She'd seen it in the documents. Eleanor Blackwood, witness to the adoption proceedings 31 years ago. "I don't know what you mean." "Your grandfather's cabin holds many memories," Eleanor continued, her voice deceptively gentle. "Some are better left undisturbed." Detective Morrison shifted uncomfortably. "Miss Chen, There's been some concern about your investigation into your family history. Sometimes the past should stay buried. Sarah's mind raced. How did they know she was here? How did they know what she'd found? I have every right to be in my grandfather's cabin. Eleanor smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. Of course you do, dear. But Marcus wouldn't want you to be hurt by things that happened long before you were born, things that were done to protect you. Protect me from what? The question escaped before Sarah could stop herself. The two exchanged a glance that made Sarah's stomach clench. Eleanor stepped closer, and Sarah caught a whiff of expensive perfume mixed with something medicinal. Your mother was very young when she made her choices, Eleanor said softly. 16, frightened, involved with people who could have destroyed her life. Marcus helped arrange your adoption to keep you safe from those influences. My mother? Sarah's voice barely functioned. She's alive? Detective Morrison cleared his throat. Miss Chen, I think you should consider returning to the city. This isolation isn't good for someone in your condition. Sarah felt the baby kick, as if responding to her elevated stress. Are you threatening me? Not at all, Eleanor assured her quickly. We're concerned about your well-being. The cabin is so remote, and if something were to happen... A crash from the back room made all three of them turn. Sarah's heart hammered as she heard Tommy's muffled cry. Before she could move, Detective Morrison was pushing past her into the cabin. "Tommy!" Sarah called out, following him despite Eleanor's restraining hand on her arm. They found Tommy sitting on the floor of the back room, surrounded by scattered papers. He must have knocked over a box while trying to stay hidden. Detective Morrison was already reaching for the documents when Tommy spoke up with startling clarity. Those are private papers. You need a warrant to take them. Sarah stared at her 6-year-old son in amazement. Detective Morrison paused, his hand hovering over the scattered documents. Eleanor moved into the room, her composure finally cracking. Marcus always was too thorough with his record-keeping. Sarah knelt beside Tommy, gathering him close while trying to shield him from whatever was about to happen. These are just old family documents, nothing that would interest the police. Birth certificates can be very interesting, Eleanor said quietly, picking up one of the papers, especially when they tell different stories. The birth certificate in Eleanor's hands bore Sarah's name, but listed different parents than she'd ever known. The mother's name was listed as Jennifer Blackwood, and the father's section was blank. Jennifer was my daughter, Eleanor said, her mask of gentility finally slipping completely. And Marcus Thompson made sure I never saw my granddaughter again. The storm outside mirrored the chaos in Elena's mind as she stared at the photographs scattered across the cabin's wooden floor. Tommy sat cross-legged beside her, his small fingers tracing the edges of images that revealed a truth she'd never imagined possible. Her grandfather hadn't been the simple woodsman she'd grown up believing him to be. "Mama, why does Grandpa Great look so different in these pictures?" Tommy asked, holding up a black-and-white photograph of a younger Marcus Whitmore in what appeared to be a military uniform, standing beside men in expensive suits. Elena's hands trembled as she examined the documents they'd found behind the hidden wall. Bank records, correspondence with government officials, and most disturbing of all, a detailed map of the surrounding forest marked with locations she didn't recognize. The numbers on those bank statements made her stomach lurch. Millions of dollars had flowed through accounts bearing her grandfather's name over the span of 3 decades. A sharp knock at the door made them both freeze. Elena quickly gathered the photographs, her heart hammering against her ribs. The knock came again, more insistent this time, followed by a voice she recognized with growing dread. "Mrs. Castillo, I know you're in there. We need to talk." "Detective Morrison." Elena motioned for Tommy to stay silent as she approached the window, peering through a gap in the curtains. Morrison stood on the porch, but he wasn't alone. 2 other men flanked him, their dark clothing and rigid postures suggesting they weren't local law enforcement. "I'm going to count to 10, then we're coming in," Morrison called out. "There's nowhere to run, Elena. The road's blocked, and these woods have too many secrets for you to navigate alone." Elena's mind raced. The back window in the bedroom, it was their only chance. She grabbed Tommy's hand and the manila envelope containing the most damning evidence, then led him quietly toward the rear of the cabin. Behind them, Morrison's countdown echoed through the walls. 7, 8. Elena pushed open the bedroom window, the cold mountain air rushing in to meet them. She helped Tommy climb through first, then followed, dropping into the mud just as she heard the front door splinter open. "Move," she whispered, pulling Tommy toward the tree line. The forest that had seemed so peaceful during their arrival now felt ominous and threatening. Every shadow could hide danger, every sound might signal pursuit. They stumbled through the underbrush, Elena's pregnancy making each step more difficult. The documents in the envelope pressed against her chest where she'd tucked them inside her coat. Behind them, flashlight beams swept through the cabin windows, and she could hear Morrison's voice giving sharp commands to his companions. There, Tommy pointed to a cluster of large boulders about 50 yards ahead. "We can hide there, Mama?" Elena nodded, grateful for her son's quick thinking. They reached the rocky outcropping just as the first flashlight beam swept across the forest behind them. Elena pulled Tommy close, both of them breathing hard as they crouched in the narrow space between the boulders. The beam passed over them twice before moving on. Elena waited until the voices grew distant before pulling out her cell phone. No signal. Of course there wouldn't be, not this deep in the mountains. "Mama, I'm scared," Tommy whispered against her shoulder. "I know, baby, but we're going to figure this out." Elena's voice was steadier than she felt. The documents in her coat seemed to burn against her skin, each revelation more shocking than the last. Her grandfather had been involved in something far beyond simple land deals or tax evasion. The correspondence she'd glimpsed mentioned shipments, routes through the forest, and payments to officials for looking the other way. A new sound made them both tense, the low rumble of vehicles approaching. Through the trees, Elena could see headlights cutting through the darkness, too many to count. Whatever operation Morrison was running, it was larger than she'd imagined. "We need to move deeper into the forest," she whispered to Tommy. "Can you remember any of those paths from Grandpa's map?" Tommy nodded solemnly. There was a trail marked in red that went to something called the North Cache. It started near a big dead tree with white marks on it. Elena closed her eyes, trying to recall the map's details. The red trail, it had led to coordinates that corresponded with some of the largest monetary transactions in her grandfather's records. Whatever was hidden at that location might be the key to understanding everything. The sound of boots crunching through dead leaves grew closer. Elena made her decision. They would have to risk moving deeper into the forest, following a map created by a man whose true nature she was only beginning to understand. The baby in her womb shifted restlessly, as if sensing the danger that surrounded them. "Stay close to Mama," she whispered to Tommy, and together they disappeared deeper into the mountain wilderness, carrying secrets that others were willing to kill for. The silence stretched between them like a chasm, broken only by Tommy's shallow breathing from where he still sat, transfixed by the journals. Sarah felt the weight of generations pressing down on her shoulders, secrets that had festered in darkness, now exposed to the harsh light of truth. "We have to destroy them," she whispered, her hand instinctively moving to her belly. "All of it. The journals, the photographs, everything." Marcus stepped closer, his eyes never leaving her face. "You can't erase what happened, Sarah. What your family did." "My family?" The words came out sharper than she intended. "I wasn't even born yet. Neither was my mother when most of this happened." She gestured wildly at the scattered evidence of her grandfather's crimes. "How am I responsible for what he did?" "You're not responsible for his actions," Marcus said quietly, "but you are responsible for what happens next." Tommy looked up from the journal in his lap, his young face etched with confusion that broke Sarah's heart. "Mommy, what did great-grandpa do? Why are you crying?" Before she could answer, the sound of gravel crunching outside made them all freeze. A car door slammed, followed by heavy footsteps on the cabin's front porch. Sarah's blood turned to ice as she recognized the deliberate, measured pace. "He found us," Marcus breathed. The footsteps stopped directly outside the door. No knock came, no call announcing the visitor's presence, just an ominous silence that made Sarah's skin crawl. She moved quickly to Tommy, pulling him away from the journals and behind the broken wall section. Marcus gathered the most damning documents, stuffing them into his jacket. The photographs scattered as his hands shook. "Sarah," a voice called from outside, smooth, almost paternal. "Detective Harrison, I know you're in there. We need to talk." Her mind raced. The back door was blocked by fallen timber from the storm. The windows were too small for easy escape, especially with Tommy. They were trapped. "What does he want?" Tommy whispered. Marcus caught her eye and mouthed silently. The evidence. Of course. Harrison had spent decades covering up her grandfather's crimes, protecting a network that probably extended far beyond one remote cabin. Her grandfather's journal entries had mentioned names, officials, businessmen, others who had benefited from the horrors documented in these pages. "I'm coming in, Sarah." The doorknob turned slowly. Sarah pressed Tommy deeper into the hidden space behind the wall, her heart hammering against her ribs. The baby kicked hard as if sensing her terror. The front door creaked open. Harrison's footsteps echoed through the cabin's main room, methodical and unhurried. He was confident, she realized. He believed he held all the power here. "This doesn't have to be difficult," Harrison called out. "I know what you found. I know what you think it means." Marcus tensed beside her, and she saw him calculate distances, how far to the detective, how quickly he could move, what their chances were. His hand moved to something in his belt. "But you don't understand the full picture," Harrison continued, his voice growing closer. "Your grandfather wasn't the monster those journals make him out to be. He was protecting people, protecting this community from truths that would have destroyed innocent families." Sarah bit back a bitter laugh. Protecting people. The photographs alone proved how twisted that justification was. "I can protect your family too, Sarah. Your son, your unborn child. All you have to do is give me what you found and walk away." She could see him now through a gap in the wall. Tall, grey-haired, his police uniform immaculate despite the remoteness of the location. He moved through the cabin like he'd been there before. Of course he had. He'd probably been here many times over the years, ensuring the secrets stayed buried. Tommy pressed against her side, trembling. She stroked his hair, trying to project calm she didn't feel. Harrison stopped in front of the broken wall. His pale eyes surveyed the damage, the scattered evidence, the clear signs of their discovery. A slight smile played at the corners of his mouth. "Curious children," he said, though his tone held no warmth. "They have a way of finding things that should stay lost." Marcus stepped into view, positioning himself between Harrison and the hidden alcove. "The game's over. We know everything." Harrison's smile widened. "Do you? Do you know about the federal investigation that was buried in 1978? The congressional inquiry that never happened? The families who were quietly relocated and given new identities to keep them silent?" Sarah's blood chilled. More victims, more secrets. The scope of the cover-up was staggering. "Do you know," Harrison continued, "that your grandfather kept detailed records not just of his own activities, but of everyone involved? Insurance policies, he called them. Names, dates, locations." His eyes glittered. "Those records ensure that this secret dies with us, or a lot of powerful people fall." The baby kicked again, harder this time, and Sarah gasped involuntarily. Harrison's head snapped toward the sound. The thunderstorm that had been brewing all evening finally broke as Sarah clutched the leather journal to her chest, her hands trembling. The rain hammered against the cabin's windows while Tommy sat cross-legged on the dusty floor, still staring at the hidden compartment where he'd found their family's darkest secret. "Mom, I don't understand," he whispered, his 8-year-old voice barely audible over the storm. "Why did Grandpa hide all those pictures?" Sarah's throat constricted as she looked at the photographs scattered around them. Dozens of images spanning decades, showing her grandfather with people she'd never seen before. People who looked terrified, people who appeared to be pleading. And in the center of it all, a younger version of the man she'd idolized her entire life, wearing a uniform she now recognized from history books. The journal's final entry, dated just weeks before her grandfather's death, contained a confession that made her stomach turn. He hadn't been the war hero she'd believed him to be. He'd been something else entirely, something that explained the mysterious monthly payments that had been funding her family for years, payments she'd assumed were from investments, but now understood were much more sinister in origin. "Sarah," David's voice cut through her spiraling thoughts. He stood in the doorway, soaked from his frantic drive through the storm, his face pale with exhaustion. "I got your message. What's happening?" She couldn't bring herself to speak, simply handed him the journal. As his eyes scanned the pages, she watched his expression shift from confusion to horror to something approaching despair. The man she loved, the father of her unborn child, was reading about atrocities committed by the grandfather whose money had paid for their wedding, their house, their entire life together. "Jesus Christ," David breathed, sinking into the moth-eaten armchair beside the hidden wall. "Sarah, this means—" "I know what it means." Her voice was hollow. The baby kicked inside her as if sensing the tension, and she pressed a protective hand to her belly. "Every dollar we've lived on, every bill that's been paid, it's all blood money." Tommy had gone very quiet, his young mind struggling to process the adult horror unfolding around him. He picked up one of the photographs, a group of children no older than himself, their faces etched with fear, and held it up to his mother. "Were these kids hurt, Mum?" The innocent question shattered what remained of Sarah's composure. She pulled Tommy close, breathing in his familiar scent of grass stains and bubblegum, trying to anchor herself to something pure in a world that had suddenly turned upside down. Outside, a branch cracked and fell, the sound making them all jump. The storm was getting worse, and Sarah realized they were trapped here with this terrible knowledge, forced to confront a legacy that poisoned everything they'd built. "There's more," David said quietly, turning to a page near the back of the journal. "He writes about people looking for him, people who never stopped hunting war criminals. That's why he changed his name, why he hid out here." David's voice cracked. "Sarah, he was afraid they'd come for his family too, for you." The implications hit her like a physical blow. The strange phone calls to their house that hung up when she answered. The man in the dark sedan who'd been parked across from Tommy's school last week. The feeling she'd had for months that they were being watched. "They know," she whispered. "They found us." As if summoned by her words, headlights suddenly swept across the cabin's front windows. A car door slammed in the storm, then another. Heavy footsteps approached the porch, deliberate and unhurried. David moved to the window, peering through the rain-streaked glass. Two men. They're not running from the storm. Sarah's mind raced through their options. The cabin was isolated, no neighbors for miles. Her phone had no signal. The car was parked behind the cabin, but getting to it would mean crossing open ground. The footsteps stopped at the front door. A firm, measured knock echoed through the cabin. "Sarah Elizabeth Chen," a voice called through the storm, using her maiden name, the name connected to her grandfather's true identity. "We know you're in there. We know what you found. We'd like to talk." Tommy pressed against her side, his small body shaking. The baby inside her seemed to sense the danger, kicking frantically. David had moved away from the window, positioning himself between his family and the door. "We're not here to hurt you," the voice continued, patient and professional. "We're here to offer you a choice, the same choice we offered your grandfather all those years ago." Sarah's blood ran cold as she remembered another entry in the journal, one she hadn't shared with David. Her grandfather hadn't been hiding from these people. He'd been working with them. The door handle began to turn. The morning sun filtered through the cabin windows as Maya sat at her grandfather's old wooden table, the journal open before her. Tommy slept peacefully in the corner, finally at rest after the harrowing night. Her hand moved instinctively to her belly, feeling the gentle movements of her unborn child, movements that now felt like hope rather than burden. The truth about Marcus Chen's murder had shattered everything she thought she knew about her family, but it had also freed her from a legacy of silence and fear. Her grandfather hadn't been the cold, distant man she remembered. He'd been protecting her, carrying the weight of his brother's crime so she could live without that shadow. Detective Rodriguez had called an hour ago. David was in custody, charged with attempted murder and conspiracy. The evidence from the hidden room, photographs, documents, recordings, painted a clear picture of his obsession and the lengths he'd gone to claim what he believed was rightfully his. The Chen family would finally have justice for their father's death. Maya closed the journal and walked to the window, looking out at the forest that had seemed so menacing just days ago. Now it felt peaceful, protective even. This place had saved them, just as her grandfather had intended. Tommy stirred behind her, yawning as he sat up from the makeshift bed. "Mom, are we going home now?" She turned to face her son, this brave little boy who had unlocked the secrets that set them free. "I don't know, sweetheart. What do you think? Do you want to go back to the city?" He considered this seriously, as he did most things. "Can we stay here sometimes? I like it. It feels like Grandpa is still here." Maya's throat tightened. "I think he is, Tommy. I think he's been here all along, waiting for us." The sound of a car approaching made them both look toward the door. Maya tensed instinctively, but through the window she saw Detective Rodriguez stepping out of her patrol car. Behind her, another vehicle pulled up, a familiar sedan that made Maya's heart race. Her mother emerged from the passenger seat, moving slowly but deliberately toward the cabin. Maya hadn't seen her in months, not since their bitter argument about Maya's pregnancy and financial troubles, but here she was, her face etched with concern and something that looked remarkably like regret. Maya opened the door as they approached. Detective Rodriguez smiled warmly. "Thought you might want some company while we finish processing everything. Found someone at the hospital who was very worried about you." Her mother stopped a few feet away, studying Maya's face. "When Detective Rodriguez called and told me what happened, Maya, I had no idea. About David, about any of it." The two women stood in awkward silence until Tommy bounded forward. "Grandma, we found a secret room." And Mom read Grandpa's journal, and there were bad men, but we're okay now. Despite everything, Maya found herself smiling at her son's enthusiastic summary. Her mother knelt down to embrace Tommy, tears streaming down her face. "I'm so glad you're safe, sweetheart. Both of you." Over Tommy's head, her mother's eyes met Maya's. "I should have listened to you about David. Should have listened to you about a lot of things. I was scared of losing what little security I had left, but I almost lost something far more precious." Maya felt her own tears beginning to fall. "Mom, No, let me say this. Your grandfather would be proud of how you protected Tommy, how you found the truth. He always believed in doing what's right, even when it's hard. I forgot that for a while." Detective Rodriguez cleared her throat gently. "I'll need a few more statements, but the DA believes you have a strong case for full custody, Maya. David's actions have made his motives very clear. And there's something else. The Chen family has decided not to pursue any claims against the property. They said justice for their father was all they wanted." Maya sank into one of the porch chairs, overwhelmed. Everything that had seemed impossible just days ago was falling into place. "I don't even know what to say." "Say you'll let me help," her mother said quietly. "Say you'll let me be part of your lives again. Both your lives," she added, glancing meaningfully at Maya's belly. Tommy tugged on his grandmother's sleeve. "Can you come see the secret room? Mom says we might stay here sometimes, and you could stay too." Her mother looked questioningly at Maya, who nodded slowly. "The cabin is ours now, really ours. Maybe it's time to make some new memories here." As they walked back inside together, Maya felt a presence she couldn't quite explain, a warmth, a sense of completion. Her grandfather's secrets had nearly destroyed them, but ultimately they had saved her family and brought them back together. The truth had been buried for decades, but like all important truths, it had found a way to surface when it was needed most. Now, finally, they could begin again.